So if we talk about the shift from a petrol-based carbon to a plant-based carbon, and I guess what I'm curious is to hear the panel's discussion is we're probably going to, before too long, get into some interesting questions about morals and values and government policy with respect to things like genetically modified organisms, who has the right to the plant genomic material. Could be interesting discussions in terms of, particularly as we move into the developing world, and the vast array of great plant species that we have there. And I guess I'd just like to open up that avenue for discussion and hear what you have to say.
An initial comment, at least, just in terms of like science policy and innovation policy and so on, is I think that what is fundamentally most important is to ensure that the avenues and opportunities are kept as wide open as possible to encourage innovation. And one thing that is absolutely central to encouraging innovation is ensuring that people who are most close to the resource, like individual farmers, for example, and farming communities, have the opportunity to build on their own innovations, their own local knowledge about agroecosystems and agricultural systems generally. And one of the things I think that people have been, like activists and other observers have been especially concerned about GM technology is about how that form of technology, because of the various kind of legal apparatus around it, has the effect of stifling innovation because it removes ownership over the food production system and the seed production system from the individual farmers and farming families and farming communities. So I think, above all, we have to ensure that whatever legal apparatus we put in place with respect to like plant-based carbon production or agricultural production generally, we have to ensure that as much opportunity for creativity and innovation and ownership of the fruits of innovation are held by individual farmers themselves and not by larger entities, especially in the private sector.
If I can jump in from a developing world perspective here, much of the developing world doesn't have the luxury of thinking about this. When there's a great proverb there's a Zimbabwean proverb I like to say a lot, but it says, when the level of the water hole drops, the animals look at each other differently. And I can assure you it's not kindly. The level of the water hole in the developing world is exceedingly low. And many of them are umbilically linked to a developmental trajectory based on restrictions to trading. One of the things we haven't talked about is food, for example, which is, of course, one of the best forms of carbon. And some obscene figure like 25% of the world's population consumes 85% of the world's food. There are issues there that relate to trade, that relate to protectionism. Those are the same issues why people in Senegal will buy a tomato grown in Spain in a hothouse. These are large issues that we have to face, but one of the things we can begin to do at home is to insist that our governments have foreign policies which are much fairer to the developing world. An example which stands out in mind is Brazil. Brazil is a country that is self-sufficient in terms of domestic petroleum, yet it's invested heavily into biomass energy. And it has a policy which equates the use of petroleum and biomass in a way which is not only environmentally sensible, but economically sensible for its people. We just returned from a trip to Brazil, myself, Neil Emery, and Laziz Bouzidi. And they're building massively. But when you look deeper into how they're building, it's very thoughtful from a fossil carbon perspective. But they haven't done anything as silly as to suggest that we've got all this petroleum, we're not going to use it because we're going to grow and compete based only in biomass. So solutions have to be very sensible when we approach these things. The GMO issue, it will become a non-issue unless those people have choice to put food on the table.
I'd like to take it to the local. And just looking around the Trent University campus, there is a number of ecosystems, including farming systems. And one of the key questions, not to stay with the gloom and doom that, this catastrophe is an impending catastrophe. What do we do about how can we act now to adapt and to avoid? Get involved in the local community. We've been trying to get involved with a few students in doing biochar. I don't know if any of you know about biochar, for instance, black carbon. James Lovelock, in his the proponent of the Gaia theory, mentioned that if all farmers were to, instead of putting the crop residues into the soil, which eventually ends up being decomposed and end up back in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide and methane, if the majority of them were to, through slow pyrolysis, were to char those crop residues and put them back in the soil, achieving residence times of sometimes 1,000 years, if that simple mechanisms could be widespread, we would be bringing the carbon dioxide levels to pre-industrial levels. Just by that simple act, but convince all the farmers, you need to inform them. And how do you can convince them then that that is a viable option? By the way, the federal government is organizing organized a panel in Montreal, and the Ontario government is organizing another panel here in Ontario in a couple of weeks about how we can use sustainable land management, including biochar options, for carbon sequestration and mitigation options. So those are there's something moving, there's something going on, and also if you get involved locally in the sustainable agricultural program, for instance, with the farmers in trying to demonstrate that this is possible, that this is feasible, that this is within reach, and that may be an avenue to start get the community thinking, coalescing around certain areas of mitigation or adaptation.
Just and from a sort of behavioral perspective, I would just add that one of the things I worry about with regard to that is the sort of complacency that kicks in when people feel that there is a solution outside me, therefore I'm not going to change my usage patterns. I can continue to use the same amount of energy. It may be derived from a different source, but I'm still going to demand that same level of energy use. A very interesting issue relates to increased efficiency, for example, in furnace systems, in forced air furnace systems, that should have resulted in less fuel use, but what that actually ultimately increased it was by 30% the size of the average house in Canada, right? So if we think it's there, we'll use it to its max, and that type of thinking must change. And deprivation-based models are not very successful in changing human behavior. So a very important thing is to have alternate sources of reinforcement. And everyone wants to feel good. So to try to offer them different ways to feel good about different things other than just consumption. And lots of developed countries are very good at that, like Scandinavian countries.